Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Psychedelic Chat brought to you by the Organization of Psychedelic and Entheogenic Nurses, OPENurses. I'm Angela Ward, one of our founding members here, and we're excited to welcome you for a conversation today with Norma Burton. So as you're coming on, would you please post in the chat where you're watching from, what license perhaps you have, and we definitely will be opening up for questions towards the end. So we're excited that you're joining us. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, would you please like and subscribe to our channel? That really helps. Invite your friends. We love all of that. So I'm going to introduce Norma to you, and then we'll pull her on screen and have a really great conversation. I just want to say before we begin, it's been such an honor to get to know Norma over the last couple of years, actually. She was an amazing facilitator at the Immersion Retreat with Synthesis, a once-in-a-lifetime experience that I got to share with her. And in preparation for this interview, we've been having some really fantastic conversations about the emerging psychedelic field. So I'm glad you're here joining us. So let me tell you about Norma. So with 8 years of graduate training in the psychology of religions, 5 years in Jungian analysis, and over 30 years as a trauma healing counselor, Norma brings a high level of expertise to the arena of human transformation. She has been immersed for decades with shamans from around the world, steeped in Buddhism and neuropsychology, sprinkled with quantum physics and systems change theory. She founded and directed a state-certified addiction recovery and mental health center where holistic healing and altered states were proven most effective in healing trauma and achieving addiction recovery. Norma was the director of Battered Women's Shelters for a decade and was eventually elected as the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence executive director. Norma's significant client base of global leaders is due to her unique methodology of trauma healing called the Journey to Completion. She has led hundreds of people all the way through to complete and lasting breakthroughs. Her work is very popular with all who seek to be trained in this unusual yet effective method of integrating the gifts of the shadow archetype, which we're going to talk about more today. This somatic-oriented process is highly effective at addressing deep-seated issues such as trauma of all kinds, healing from abuse, addiction recovery, improving communications within work relationships, and relieving anxiety, depression, and phobias. Norma is an Oregon resident and has her finger on the pulse of the challenges surrounding the legal use of psilocybin in the state. And we're hoping to speak a little bit about that as well today. So you can learn more about her at normaburton.com. So please give Norma a warm welcome to our OPENurses community. Welcome, welcome, Norma. Yay, it's so great to have you here. Thank you. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us a bit about the trajectory of your career and what led you to get involved with psychedelics and psychedelics for healing.
Sure. Well, I was speaking to this group of nurses, that my grandmother was a nurse.
Wow.
She was quite a unique character because during the Depression era, she got moved to want to be of service to people that were in need in particular ways. And she got the idea of wanting to move to a Native American reservation where people didn't have access to food or medical care. So our family moved there, and she set up a clinic as well as a grocery store. So through the years, my grandfather and she gave away a lot of groceries and did the medical care too. And she also was a person who the people would come to about their dreams and bring hurt baby animals to her. And so she was really one with the tribe in such a deep way that I didn't really even realize until I was an adult that I had quite an unusual bicultural upbringing. So my grandmother, the nurse, had a huge impact on my life. And to see what a loving, caring person she was, I think about nurses with a very warm heart.
I'm so glad you're here.
And so how I got into this work, well, I've always been on a path that combines cutting-edge psychotherapy with a transpersonal lens. in my early career, I worked in mental hospitals, community mental health clinics, and then, as you were saying, that led into working in child protective services and domestic violence. So immersed in trauma, especially family trauma. So I really am thankful for all that early exposure to the depths of suffering, psychological, physical, emotional, family suffering, and that led me to seeking things that would really work. There was so much I was encountering that seemed to just further exploit people that were suffering. And so I ended up working with Stan Groff in the Bay Area in those early days when we were coming up with what was called the Spiritual Emergency Network, which was helping people in severe states, in psychotic states, without the use of medications. So that was an excellent training. And later on in my own mental health and drug and alcohol recovery center, I was really able to help people, along with my psychiatrist and doctor friends, to be able to come to a deep level of healing, and some of them even get off of psychotropic medications and be very stabilized. So that's one important part of my work through the years. And then also being very interested in spirituality and the pastoral counseling aspect of things. I got my degree in hospice chaplaincy too. Um, and so for a number of years worked as a hospice chaplain and as a congregational minister too. So uh, also was immersed in Buddhism, as you were alluding to. I lived in Japan for many years and studied Buddhism in its own setting. And so I come at this field of psychedelics from the place of mindfulness and doing years of deep meditation, like 30-day retreats, silent retreats, and so forth. And then also was so privileged to study with shamanic teachers, indigenous leaders, especially from Central and South America. Before there were cell phones or computers or ways of finding people, it was all by word of mouth. And I was led to some amazing teachers and worked for a long time with one in particular, Guadalupe de los Rios, who's a Huichol from central Mexico. So I say I got my PhD in shadow work by being around her.
Wow.
So those are some tastes of my background and how I got into this work.
Yes. So you've had a wide variety of like Western education and then immersive indigenous education from around the world. One thing I'm really curious about is I know in this emerging medical model, a lot of people do feel the lack of the spiritual aspect in psychedelic work. And you mentioned you were a hospice chaplain. And I've heard from a lot of hospice nurses that there's a bit of a longing for that framework in dying. And could you speak to that, the value of bringing the spirit back into these practices?
I'm excited about the potential for psychedelics, especially psilocybin in palliative care and for people heading toward their own death. I've trained quite a few hospice nurses. It's not official yet, but they're wanting to be trained and educated about facilitating people who are dying with psilocybin. So it's very exciting to think about the fact that these plant medicines, this fungi, were used to help people experience death before we die. So that's one thing that they do with us, right? They're taking us on an initiatory journey into our own deep subconscious, into the underworld, into the place where we meet our fears, where we meet especially the fear of death. And in their encounter what we need to, the gifts that are there for us, so that we can come back from the underworld dive into a greater consciousness and less fear of death. So it just seems like a great ideal experience for people who are approaching death.
Yeah.
If you can experience a taste of what you're afraid of and come back and you're still alive and have a chance to integrate it and then work toward the big passage that we're all going to take, what an opportunity for people. So I really hope that things develop so that nurses in palliative care are able to be there for people in that way.
I hope so. Could you speak a little bit about what you envision the difference between nursing and medical care, or how nurses may fit in this role?
The difference between nursing and medical care, right? When you think about who nurses are, they are the ones who are different from doctors. They have more time to be in contact with the people, and they have that skill of being with people in a variety of experiences, talking to the families, helping people with their fears. As we know, sometimes the medical model is referred to as a broken model. It's not really helping people. But if anybody is helping people, it is nurses and doctors who are there to care deeply. But nurses in particular, right, have a role where they can have the medical understanding that they do, and yet be in this more holistic caregiving mindset towards the people. So that's got a lot of potential
I
in
hope so.
the psychedelic therapy field.
Yeah, I hope so very much. When we were talking prior to this interview, you have a lot of education in the Western paradigm, including a lot of education in psychology and such. Why did you choose to go for your Master's of Divinity instead of the traditional licensed therapist route?
I was telling you that I did that quite consciously early on, because as I thought into the restrictions in terms of insurance and licensure that can be on psychotherapists, I realized that a pastoral counselor has a different kind of licensure. We still have many, many years of training, and I majored in the psychology of religions and psychotherapy in a pastoral counseling sense. But with that different kind of licensure, I'm free to be with people in a more pastoral role. That means in community with them. Don't have to be as boundaried or isolated. And that really fits for how plant medicines have been used traditionally through the centuries with indigenous communities. It's always been not an individual experience, but one that takes place in community. And the benefits of the plant medicine are always for the benefit of the relationships in the community, for the whole. When I was with the Huichol, they wouldn't do a ceremony without the children, the elders, all ages being there. It was a must that the whole community had to be present. So we have a lot to learn from that, and really, I think, need to feel into how our type of care, how our set and setting that we're using for people can be more communal, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find that more effective for my practice. It's a hybrid one-on-one and group program. And there's something really, there's really an amazing synergy that happens between everybody kind of working towards their own well-being collectively. That's really special. I'd love to hear more about your community experience, and if you would share with our audience about what it was like for you to train and experience your peyote ceremony and the ways that the difference between someone who might be going in for a one-off ketamine session where they maybe do a screening intake, they get their ketamine and then they go home, or they do it at home with no support or community. Yeah, tell us about the trajectory of that peyote experience you told me about once.
Well, I was lucky to be able to be in Mexico many times with Guadalupe as my teacher, and to be in community with the Huichol people. And there was always a lot of preparation. In fact, Westerners, northern Americans can hardly believe how much preparation would go into a ceremony. So we would prepare for months, maybe even a year in advance.
Wow.
Not only that, but as an individual, you get trained over a long period of time before you're trusted to be in the ceremony as a foreigner. So I went through 20 years of training with Guadalupe.
Wow.
So that's much different than people are thinking of nowadays to be trained to be a facilitator of psychedelic services, right? So it's a training period, and always there are the Mirakame or the master shamans present, and everyone is very honorifically serving them and helping them to be present and do what they need to do. So the whole community is involved in the preparation. When we went on a really key ceremonial adventure in my life, it was a 13-day trip that we went deep into the wilderness, and the preparations, for example, were that we spent a whole day on a vision fast by ourselves, going out, each of us individually, to connect with spirit in the natural setting. And then we would make art projects together. The Huichol are really big on, as you know, beautiful art that they design both for the intent setting going into the ceremony. We would make prayer arrows and weave God's eye weavings. God's eye weaving, when you think about that, it's to focus your attention on a God's eye view. So everyone makes these weavings that are focusing your attention as you do them. So a lot of artwork goes into the preparation, which I use in my preparations for people now too, because the symbol systems are what get ignited in the mind. So that this field of semiotics and the power of symbols to teach us when we're in that arena of the symbolic in our own altered state. So they use a lot of art to prepare. And then extensive fasting, complete water fast for 3 days, and then no water or anything for a whole day.
Wow.
And going into the ceremony, which is very powerful physically, emotionally, purging, cleansing. And then in the aftermath, you are still there with them in the wilderness for 5 days afterwards. And during that whole time, you can't take a bath or wash off anything that's happened. So right, it's hard for us. Southerners are used to being so clean all the time, right? So those are just some examples of how deep and thorough the experience is to really take you into a liminal space. Liminal meaning at the edge of our usual environment and at the edge of consciousness. So they go through a lot of deep preparation and work to take us into that liminal space and have it be something that's memorable and very different from what you typically experience. So get at what you were wanting me to talk about.
Yeah, well, when you're speaking about this, you're saying that the ceremony itself was about 13 days, but it took about a year to prepare for the ceremony,
right.
And then a period of time to integrate following.
Right. The integration wasn't just those 5 days that we were still together, but we stayed in touch with one another and with Guadalupe and kept coming to deeper and deeper understandings of what had happened. So it would usually be a year or 2 years of integration.
Wow.
So they don't do just one plant medicine journey after another. No, it's done in their tribal setting, maybe once every 6 months or once a year. So that's much different than our culture is approaching it, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Sometimes I think our drug-seeking mentality is influencing the way people think that psychedelics should be done. Whereas
Yes.
I was brought up in that whole different approach to it.
I've seen that a lot where people seem to be chasing the peak experience of the psychedelic themselves rather than doing deep preparation and integration. And why do you, I mean, I know culturally we're kind of in that fix it culture and something else outside of you is going to fix you. Could you speak to what the value is of slowing down and taking our time around these expansive states?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing we could talk about is the sinking into our deep unconscious, sinking into the underworld. In the cosmology of many indigenous peoples, there are three main zones that we go to: the underworld, the middle world, and the upper world.
Mhm.
And many years are spent going into the underworld first. Why? Why do we have to go into the underworld first? Well, it's our own deep unconscious, but it's also going deep into the earth. The reason we have to go there is to encounter our own shadow, meaning our own trauma. And where we have trauma will be the places that we potentially could misuse power.
Mm.
Develop defense mechanisms around our trauma situations, right? And so if we're defended, we're not centered, we're likely to either, be shying away from power and misusing it that way, or overriding others and misusing it that way. So Guadalupe used to talk about that we have to explore a whole theme of our shadow work each time we would do a plant medicine ceremony. So we work on one thread of a pattern at a time and heal that thread of the pattern. What I came to name my process that I created after all of my psychology training and working with the ritual was the journey to completion. And the reason I called it that was because Guadalupe would tell us about, we pick up one thread, like a thread that we're weaving through a rug weaving. That's one thread of our shadow material, one pattern that we're tracing all the way through and connecting all the dots in our life about this particular pattern that we have. And we work that one all the way through, and that usually involves working over a period of time. So people that do my journey to completion do it over a period of a year.
Mhm.
It used to be that I didn't allow them to do a plant medicine ceremony until the very end of that. Now that it's becoming so popular and it's requested a lot more, I'm having it punctuated 2 times by plant medicine ceremony to gain deeper insights. But just saying too, the deep dive into the underworld and into our altered states doesn't even have to have plant medicine to ignite it, right? We have such abilities to go into lucid states through drumming journeys and through our dreaming and lucid dreaming that I really like to teach people about the psychonavigation skills that we need to learn just within our own access to altered states. So back to this completing of the journey. So we bring one thread of our shadow work all the way through, tie it off. And then a year, maybe 2 years later, another shadow complex will come up, another set of our defense mechanisms. We take that thread and bring it all the way through, tie that one off. We keep doing this throughout our lives. So by the end of our life, we've woven a whole rug, so to speak. And we've completed our incarnational destiny. So that's how you can understand the journey to completion.
I
It's a
love
long path to completion, right? But if we walk it systematically, we can complete what we're here to do.
I have so many questions, and I'm a couple places I'd like to go because as you're talking about this, of course, I'm thinking about the shadow present in our current broken healthcare system and how can we apply this approach to bigger groups. I know you've worked with companies and businesses before to help them see the shadow that they're carrying and kind of process it. I'd love to hear a bit about that and what you might be seeing as some of the shadow that's emerging in this field, especially around some of the gatekeeping or legalization or medical model?
Yes, it's been said that our psilocybin movement has to be about more than molecules that are getting extracted and served up profitably, right? This psychedelic renaissance, this return to valuing psychedelics that's happening in the medical world is super important, and I'm very glad it's happening. And yet, when you think about it, it's religion that was traditionally where humans looked for this type of deeper integration with themselves and social transformation. So they were relating in a whole culture of religious mores and practices that would reduce violence and encourage people to live in society in a balanced way with one another. The root word of religion is religare, which means to bind together. And that's what psilocybin does too, right? The mycelial network of psilocybin, it opens people's hearts to more compassion for one another and opens their third eye. So all of that is going on in working with plant medicines. So it's traditionally been in that more religious or beautifully held, deeply therapeutic space. And so how are we going to do it in a way that really honors what the plant medicine is within this this medical system, this medical industrial complex? I've been an executive within the medical world, and we have to speak the story of well-being instead of pathology. And I really trust that we can do it differently, right? And that is going to require a whole different way that we do economics, across the board, not just in the medical world. But it's been said that the way that our economic structures are now may actually be producing mental illness. We have such an extractivistic type of economics that uses pressure and force, no time to contemplate, no time for compassion or going to the depths. We've got to rush, and no thinking over the long term, being more strategic about it, just immediate gratification, quick fix. So that type of pressure and fast-paced hype is strangling the psilocybin movement as we speak.
Yeah. Are you seeing that in Oregon through the work that's happening there?
So many big companies that have rushed into Oregon, right? And bringing in all of their funding. It's wonderful on the one hand, but it also it's said, like, put a Bunsen burner under the people that are trying to formulate these programs, because once big money is involved, then big results are expected, return on investment. And I've seen, sadly, that can turn some of the ways that psilocybin therapies are being carried out as too much of a conveyor belt. People are just brought in and out quickly, and they're not encouraged to express more of what's going on with them emotionally, or have more free expression or into attunement to what's going on in their bodies, but just come in, get it over with, and leave, and don't really speak of the deeper things that might have happened. So that's one of the ways that it's being badly affected. I'm not saying that all of the facilitations are going down that path, but that's one of the dangers of having a lot of pressure on these organizations to do a lot of sessions and train a lot of people quickly. I was at the Oregon Rules Committee for the state mental health department as it's been formulating the systems, and there's been a lot of discussion amongst the doctors and therapists about how can this really unfold in Oregon in a way that will be safe for people. So
I think that you're bringing up a really good point around safety and the slower pace. There's always concerns around how do we pay for it. And psychedelics seem in a way kind of completely counter capitalist culture, so that makes it really tough. And yet we are in a time where people are suffering greatly, and these plants and do really seem to offer a lot of support, but especially in relationship and, like you're mentioning, with community and such. So also, I want to say deep gratitude to Oregon and all of the people that are doing really hard work and like being trailblazers in this. There's such hope there. And it's not until you start venturing out that you really can see what some of the obstacles are. Yeah, what do you think would really help in this way? How could we make this smoother for places that might be legalizing or decriminalizing as we move forward?
Well, it's interesting to look at the way that the laws are being written. We've been comparing our Oregon law to the law that's recently been written in Colorado, and then contrasting it as well with what the Netherlands has and the way that they can operate. So I'll just contrast the three just briefly.
Please,
For
yes.
example, in the Netherlands, it was set up that they can only use the truffle, which is the root of the psilocybin, not the psilocybin plant, because it's qualifies as a food substance rather than a drug. And so therefore, it can't be held in a therapeutic context. So if a doctor, nurse, or psychologist is thought to be using it therapeutically, that's illegal.
Really? Whoa.
Strange, right? So that's why when you were at the gathering last summer, the doctors and nurses and psychologists there couldn't identify themselves as such.
Wow.
Because it has to be held in a non-therapeutic way. Now, contrast that to Oregon, where it can only be done in a therapeutic context. So it has to be done by a licensed facilitator in a state licensed facility. They're running into a lot of challenges with that, which I was trying to explain to people ahead of time because I established a state certified facility and went through literally years of setting it up so that it could meet all the standards of the 300-page state regulation book, right? And there's so many regulations to meet when you're establishing a state certified facility. And they're also running into that when you're trying to establish curriculum and state certified facilitator licensures. So, for example, they've just decided that they're sending it now through the Department of Education so that that department can certify the facilitators. Wow. So there's a lot of complication when you set it up so that it has to be a state certified therapeutic facility and therapy-oriented facilitators. Another discussion I had with some psychologists in Portland, Oregon, is that the psychologists may not be able to be the ones to be the facilitators because the insurance companies are not going to cover it. Wow. So there's a lot of complications with the way that it's written in Oregon. So Colorado went the other direction, and they're allowing it to be used in people's homes and not have state trained facilitators or licensure, as long as the psilocybin itself is not being sold by the persons carrying out the gathering. So it can be done in a very non-formal setting without qualifications for who's guiding it.
Wow.
So Colorado went the opposite direction. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens right? State by state, as
Yeah.
experiments are going on with what is the best way to honor what psilocybin is and its potential.
Well, you can definitely see the pros and cons of both approaches. I mean, you spoke to how long it takes to train a facilitator in the Wechel tradition of years and years, an apprenticeship model. And then we're talking about a space where there's people who may or may not have any training or experience or education around contraindications or health concerns or that kind of thing. So there's such a spectrum there. Is there a middle ground that you see?
I lean toward the side of more training, whether it be long-term training with Indigenous elders, right? Not just a 3-week trip to the Amazon, right? But long-term training with wisdom elders is a great way to get trained, or training in psychotherapy and really understanding the shadow complex within humans, and that the psilocybin is really set up, I believe, to get us in touch with our trauma and our shadow issues. So a facilitator needs to be adept in knowing how to support somebody. So that's me. I lean toward the side of more training and being a trained therapist or trained for many years
Mm-hmm.
with Indigenous elders. But you're asking about a middle ground. So on the
Where
other
do
hand,
nurses fit in this training? Do we need advanced degrees in the psychotherapeutic model in order to do this work?
Well, let me just speak to the middle ground for a minute, and then I'll go back to that. But the middle ground, like people have been working with mushrooms on their own for many, many years. We're talking like about North American Western culture. Like I was saying, in Indigenous cultures, it's held in a community, it's held in a lineage-long understanding of the consciousness of it. But in Northwestern type of cultures, people have been doing it, guiding people, and with some, of course, very positive experiences, but also damage can be done.
Yes.
I just read an article in the New York Times where a woman was, in fact, talking about a damaging experience that she had in ketamine in a ketamine clinic. And there's more and more now coming out about experiences in altered states not being held very well in the medical setting. And so when people are in a very vulnerable state, they, they can be taken advantage of. And there have been situations being reported in the psilocybin movement of some of the leaders of it also taking advantage of people. So doing one shadow work is what I want to bring it through to, okay? A person who does their shadow work, which is your deep trauma healing work and integrating the lessons that you're learning and applying them in your life, really taking the time to do your own shadow work is the best protection and guards one from the misuse of power.
Mm-hmm.
So if a facilitator does anything else, I recommend that they do their shadow work so that they're not a person who will misuse their power. There are psychologists who don't do their shadow work, of course, doctors and nurses who don't or do, right? So it doesn't matter necessarily to have the degrees if you don't do your shadow work and handle power impeccably. But on the other hand, to have studied the body, medicine, and psychology is, I think, definitely an advantage in understanding the states that a person is going into. So
Absolutely. It's complex.
it's
Sounds
complex.
like it's a complex answer. Yes, I agree with you. There's so much harm that can be perpetuated in these expanded states that aren't even just intentional harm. poorly said word or a misplaced touch can just be devastating for people at the wrong time. And that is just heartbreaking.
Mhm.
What do you think some of the other challenges are here as this field emerges?
Hmm. Well, give me a little lead on that. Get me talking about one
Oh
challenge.
gosh, there's so many. Like, well, gatekeeping is one. Another thing that I find a little challenging is with legalization, there is, in some cases, a framework of pathologizing people in order to be able to have access to
Yes.
these medicines. And, you know, I do like the idea of the betterment of well people, or how we can, and what rights do people have to explore their own full experience of being a human, and what do we owe each other in a society to keep each other safe. um,
Yes. Those are
yeah,
great topics.
yeah.
The approach of the betterment of a person instead of pathologizing. So right now it is getting set up that uh, would be available to people medically because they have a pathology, because they have PTSD or depression or anxiety disorder, right?
Hmm.
So uh, who's thinking about that as this all gets orchestrated, right? Does that really mean that only people that have a pathology should have a right to this medicine? That is not the way it's been traditionally, right? It's been a communal medicine. So that's why some indigenous people are wishing for the decriminalization
Hmm.
of all psychedelics so that people just have access, and then the therapeutic help can be gotten when it's needed. I just heard that Vancouver, Canada, uh, just passed the law of decriminalization of all psychedelics to try to deal with their rampant death toll of people dying from overdoses.
Yeah.
So all different experiments are going on, but to, if we can, in uh, thinking of your nursing care and how people who are nurses can approach this. The whole field of complementary medicine, holistic healing, and looking at betterment and healthy health education
Hmm.
instead of coming at it just from the pathological diagnosis. That's all within the trends within nursing. So
Yeah, let me ask you a little bit more about that, because I think one of the reasons that Open Nurses has had so many nurses and allies join us is because nurses are really getting secondary trauma being in a broken healthcare system,
yes.
and are wanting to seek a deeper level of healing for a greater population. How do you think we can take a psychedelic approach to medicine rather than a medical approach to psychedelics?
I like that, right? Psilocybin, as we were saying, is a consciousness. It's a living meaning personal consciousness, is what traditional peoples believe. And so it's training us, I believe, in um, changing our systems to become a system that can uh, advance what psilocybin is trying to teach us. So mycelial networks, community healthcare practices where there are teams of people, uh, doctors, nurses, counselors, community social workers, all different kinds of roles coming together in one practice where the person's whole needs can be met. Uh, that's one vision I have of how we can just have a whole different approach to the way we approach health. I like hospice work because it's kind of like that, where a whole grouping of talents and skills are brought together to serve the family whose person is going through dying. So perhaps taking that hospice model and uh, expanding that to community healthcare model. Also, I have a friend who's getting her PhD in nursing and mental health nursing, and she went through my Journey to Completion training program and is, as you say, really dedicated to doing nursing differently. And she's very excited to have the credentials to be a psychiatric nurse, but then also be a nurse practitioner and have her own practice in a community where she can work in consortium with other healers. So that's her idea of how to go about doing it. Have you heard other people thinking in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think almost everybody I talk to at some point wants to participate in some kind of wellness center that's like a holistic place and people can have their whole selves tended to. Absolutely. Lots of people have a lot of beautiful ideas. There's just some real red tape, right? Of getting ways that we can do this and protect our licenses at the same time.
How
Yeah.
how do you think that's going to evolve? You think insurance is going to cover psilocybin for end of life care? Do you
I
think
hope
nurses
so.
will really be able to do that?
I can't speak to that, but I sure hope so. That would make a lot of sense, I think. As you said.
That brings up the issue of, also I talked to a hospice nurse and I was talking about how, coming from my traditional background with the Huichols and other native peoples and looking at the fungi and different plant medicines as a consciousness and not wanting to alter them or chop them up and take out the molecules and rearrange them. She was saying, well, look at it realistically for nurses, though. You have to be able to give a quantifiable dose in a pill to somebody. So it's going to be um, engineered that way and orchestrated into all different types of pills. It is happening, right? So I've had to let go of my purity around that a little bit.
Just having a plate of mushrooms that people
Right.
have whatever. Well, I mean, it's tricky when we're talking about things that are getting patented, though. I think that's a little bit
Mm-hmm.
upsetting for me personally. I just want to say to our audience that would love to have your questions brought forward. But before we move into that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your vision for the future of psychedelic work. And if you could have your perfect dream, how would you like this field to look, this world to look?
Well, we've got to help people to really go into their deep old stories and their wounded places and come up with the new stories for our times. So I just long for these containers to be held in an adequate and safe enough way so that people really can explore truly the ways that we have been damaged by our dominant system, the way it is structured, and uh, get re-empowered and come through, that all of us individually and collectively are able to come through to uh, using power more impeccably in our world. And
Mm,
that takes freedom of exploration in a safe container held by others who want a person to explore that deeply so that the evolutionary change can happen that adequately. So, because underneath our personal stories, there lies a deeper kind of story that we call our mythologies. And our mythologies are these tacit assumptions that we hold in common about the nature of human beings and the world. And these assumptions are deep, and we don't even realize sometimes that we're orchestrating our lives by them. They're basic questions like, why am I here? What is a self? What is real? What's important? What does uh, what does really bring about change in our world? And so, how are we going to gain reliable knowledge? Where is the truth to be found? Those are all questions of mythology. And so, you can hear my transpersonal and religion background here, but we are undergoing this evolutionary leap in consciousness. I think whether we're scientists or theologians, we all agree on that. That there are these old stories at the very roots of our identity as humans that are undergoing deconstruction right now. So, as Thich Nhat Hanh, I worked with Thich Nhat Hanh through the years, and he coined this term interbeing. We're coming through to a new story that's about interbeing instead of the old story that we've had that's all about separation. So we've got to move on through as individuals and collectively to realize that we're not just a separate self, like a soul encased in flesh or a biochemical machine, but rather that we're each like holographic mirrors of all that is. We're each a nexus point in an infinite web of relationship. We're not as separate as we think we are. We don't exist as independently as we think that we're really. It's all about relationality.
Yes.
What happens to others in the world is affecting us. And we are affecting them. So there's this co-responsibility that I see in our futures. What else?
I love that. I love it. Yes, I agree with you. I think that is so beautiful. Let's get a couple questions up on the screen. See if there's some good ones we can answer here. What are the greatest shadow areas for nurses as you see them in this work?
That's a great question. When you think of what a shadow area is, okay, it means that there is some aspect of ourselves that has been cast into the shadow. In other words, in our subconscious, hidden to ourselves, not accessible to us. And that usually happens because we've had some trauma. And so, what traumas do nurses have that have separated them from some part of themselves? So, being dominated by an authority figure or not respected somehow, not having their voice heard or not feeling empowered to do something that they know how to do. And then, so we have these parts of ourselves that get put down into our shadow that are inaccessible to us, that we have to go and search after. But then we also develop a persona, and that persona is how we present ourselves to the world. So our persona could become people-pleasing and not speaking our truth, or it could become being too harsh and mean, like people have treated us. So do you see what I'm saying? We develop both this hidden aspect of ourselves and this persona. So everyone does, but nurses might have to having more of a voice, speaking up, letting their truth be known, arising from the shadow where it's been repressed. And then they may have to deconstruct their persona that might have to do with too much people pleasing or being too strict and wanting to keep the rules too strictly so that they'll be respected in that system that can be too dysfunctional.
Well, I think sometimes too, I'll read this real quick, but I think sometimes too, as nurses, we're asked to kind of dehumanize people in front of us, or we have to put this barrier because of doing things with people's bodies that, we have to maybe do quickly or in an emergency situation that can, I think, sometimes put us in shadow places for sure.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Like, how do you keep from having your soul damaged and cutting off from your feelings when you do have to perform professionally and quickly? Well, what that requires is you doing your trauma healing. So if you're starting to realize that you're getting too cut off from yourself or hardened or cold, then you need to pause and do your deeper trauma healing so that you don't develop too much of a barrier between you and the people.
Yeah. Thank you. Shannon Hart says, thank you for sharing your journey, Norma. Any advice for a nurse who wants to get into this work professionally?
There are many discussion forums going on in this world now professionally. There's a doctor, for example, out of, I believe, Kansas, who is organizing medical people who want to gather to start speaking about and planning for palliative care. In Oregon, for example, there is a consortium of doctors and nurses who are gathering monthly to begin to talk about how are we going to work with death and dying. So I think that's one thing, is to look in your area for that type of professional discussion group going on.
Join
And
our
also,
OPENurses Facebook group.
yeah, OPENurses Facebook group, and be a mover and shaker in your own environment. It's I think it's so publicly permissible now to be speaking about psychedelic therapy, as it wasn't just a year ago. So raise questions. Ask in your professional environment, what are you doing, my hospital, about having psychedelic therapy lobbies? Or, like, there's, each state is going to be dealing with setting up laws, as it happened with cannabis, probably, the domino effect from state to state. That's going to be happening with MDMA and psilocybin. So be an activist in your area.
Yeah, well, you're kind of speaking to this next question, actually, is what advocacy role do you see nurses taking in terms of changing laws, policies, harm reduction, etc.?
Oh, that's a great question, too. I think nurses have, as you and I were talking about earlier, Angela, a particular role that they could play, because they are in the medical world, but you are in caregiver roles, so you are in a different position than doctors are. You have a different sensibility about it, and a different collegiality, in a sense, with each other. So I think nurses have, I'm not sure what it is yet to speak to it directly, but I'm tuning in through talking with Angela to the fact that nurses, just by the fact of what you do, for example, we were talking, have a particular role to play. For example, Angela and I were talking about birthing and the birthing process that nurses are so adept at taking people through, women through. The psilocybin experience could be equated with birthing. It takes
Yeah.
a deep embodiment, not being afraid of the body, going into the sensorial experiences that come up, allowing them, not running away from them, not being afraid. I'll never forget, in my birthing of my daughter, the nurse speaking to me right in the eye and saying, don't run away from it. You can be with this pain and, work it through. There's no escape. So nurses are used to telling people that, and, helping them to not run away from these deeper realms. So in terms of laws and policies and harm reduction, I hope that nurses do get involved in helping with the wording of the laws. As you can see, in Oregon, the law was written by psychologists, and it was passed surprisingly quite quickly, but then we've been left in the aftermath with all of the difficulties of what it means, the way that it was worded. So wow, if nurses could get involved in the beginning with forming these laws and policies, that would be great, so that it doesn't have to be so difficult in the aftermath of the laws being written. Study into the different laws. You can go on the Oregon Psilocybin Health Department website and read the law. Go ahead and do that. Read the law in Colorado, which is a lot shorter than the one in Oregon. Study into it yourselves and become well-versed in what the laws say. It will stimulate your thinking, knowing nursing as you do, as to what could be set up to reduce harm. So it's exciting to think about putting your nursing minds to work on creating these laws and policies and structures that will be safer for people.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'd love to continue talking, but we've come to our final question for the evening. And this is a fun one. If you could go back and give yourself, your younger self, a bit of advice, what would it be?
Well, I doubted myself a lot as I went through the years of being buffeted by the system. I think I had a lot of intuitive knowing of the ways that things needed to be based on my own inner guidance system. So I think I would say trust your inner guidance system more, and don't doubt yourself if it seems like you're ahead of your times or nobody is listening to you. Really trust your inner guidance system and your friendships with colleagues that are thinking in avant-garde ways too.
I love it. Thank you so much, Norma. If people would like to get a hold of you, what's the best way to reach you?
Well, I'll give you my email address because that's a good way to reach out to me, nburton999@gmail.com.
Could someone type that in the chat for us, please?
And also my website, normaburton.com, is a great place to go and review what I've been talking about tonight and listen to the testimonials there.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, real quickly, I'll say, Angela, that my daughter and I have just written a wonderful book that's coming out in September. And it's about altered states without the use of plant medicines through lucid dreaming.
Oh,
And so
cool.
it's called Lucid Dreaming, Lucid Living.
Ooh.
There's an oracle deck with it too, and it's a scientific study of lucidity in the dream state, as well as a lot of instructions about how to work with your own lucid state. So the website for that is luciddreaminglucidliving.com.
Beautiful. When is that book coming out? You said August?
In September or late August or September.
Okay. Is it possible to pre-order it?
Yes.
Oh, well, is
Go
that on
to
your website or the Lucid
website,
Living?
Lucid Dreaming, Lucid Living website, and you'll be able to pre-order it.
That sounds amazing. Well,
Or have us come for speaking engagements to talk about it too.
That would be great. Awesome. Well, Norma, thank you so much for being with us on Open Nurses. And audience, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back next month with another interview. So join us again. Bye, everybody.
Angela. Bye, everybody.
Bye.